My dad gambled away the $80,000. My mom worked 2 jobs to save for my college, then told me to stop being dramatic and get over it. When I asked how he could still gamble knowing what he'd done, he said, "You'll survive. I had to survive worse when I was your age." I stayed silent. That was 19 months ago. This morning, he was standing outside my apartment in tears. I just started college this year, but it almost didn't happen. Not because I didn't get accepted, but because my dad decided to treat my college fund like his personal casino account. My mom passed away when I was 12, and after that, it was just me and my dad. My mom had been very practical. She worked 2 jobs while saving every extra cent for my future. She had a life insurance policy and also put money into a dedicated college account in my name. By the time she passed, that account had over $80,000 in it, which was meant to cover my tuition, books, housing, everything. The account was supposed to be untouchable until I turned 18. But because I was a minor, my dad became the trustee of the account after my mom died. At the time, I trusted him. He told me, "Don't worry, kiddo. Your mom's dream for you will come true. I'll protect that money like it's my own." Turns out, that last part was the problem. Growing up, I noticed my dad had a thing for gambling. It started small, scratch-off lottery tickets, poker nights with friends. But by the time I was 14, I'd catch him watching live sports betting on his phone and see betting slips on the kitchen counter. If I ever asked about it, he'd wave me off with, "It's just a little fun. I'm good at it." When I was 16, there was one night where I woke up to shouting. My dad was on the phone yelling, "Double or nothing, you can't pull out now." Then he slammed the phone down, punched the wall, and muttered about bad luck. I asked what happened, and he told me I was too young to understand and to stop acting like your mother. Fast forward to my senior year of high school. I was applying to colleges, and I got into my dream school, an out-of-state university. I came running into the living room with my acceptance letter, and he barely looked up from his laptop. Instead, he said, "You know, you should consider community college first. It's cheaper." That was weird, because he'd always said the money mom left was more than enough. I pushed back, and he immediately got defensive. "I'm just saying, the world's expensive. You can't expect everything handed to you." At that point, I started to get a bad feeling. I called the bank that managed the account to ask about the balance. They told me they couldn't give me specifics until I was legally allowed, but they could confirm that the account was nearly empty. My stomach dropped. When I confronted my dad, he blew up. "You don't trust me? After everything I've done for you? Your mother's been gone for years, and I've raised you alone. You think that was free?" He then claimed he'd borrowed some of the money to pay bills when times were tight. I asked how much he'd borrowed, and he said, "It doesn't matter, I'll pay it back before you start school." That was a lie. By graduation, I found out from my aunt, his sister, that my dad had been going to the casino every weekend for over a year. He told her he was on a winning streak and was going to double the fund before I started school. Instead, he lost everything. $80,000 gone. I confronted him again, this time with my aunt there so he couldn't gaslight me. He didn't apologize. He didn't even look guilty. He smirked and said, "If you were smart, you'd understand money comes and goes." I had to take risks for our future. Our future? I had to pick up 2 part-time jobs, apply for emergency scholarships, and take out loans just to afford my first semester. Meanwhile, he still went to the casino. The breaking point came last month when I went home for the weekend. I walked into the living room and saw him sitting at his laptop, watching a live poker stream with a fresh stack of casino chips on the coffee table. I asked him how he could still gamble knowing he'd destroyed my future, and he said, "Don't be dramatic. You'll survive. I had to survive worse when I was your age." That was it for me. I told him I was done. No more visits, no more calls, no more pretending he was a father to me. I packed my things that night and went back to campus. He's been blowing up my phone ever since, alternating between angry text, "You're ungrateful. I did the best I could," and guilt trips, "You're all I have left. Don't abandon me." He even had the nerve to post on Facebook about how some kids forget who raised them, and how I was throwing away family over money. Just when I thought he couldn't hurt me anymore, I got a letter from the bank. Apparently, my mom had a second hidden account worth even more money, and my dad wants to access it. I was sitting at my desk in my dorm room with my economics textbook open when the envelope from First National Bank of Columbus landed in my mail pile. My hands started shaking as I read the official letterhead stating that a trust fund in my name containing $150,000 was set to release on my 21st birthday. The letter went on to explain that my father had filed emergency paperwork requesting immediate access as my parent and financial guardian due to what he called urgent educational expenses. Rachel looked over from her bed where she was highlighting her biology notes and saw my face go white. She walked over and read the letter over my shoulder, then whispered the exact thing I was thinking. I grabbed my phone and called the bank's trust department number listed at the bottom of the page. The representative confirmed that yes, my father had started legal proceedings 2 weeks ago to access the trust as my quote-unquote financial guardian in crisis. She explained that since I was 18, but the trust specified age 21 for release, there was technically a gray area in Ohio law that he was trying to exploit. My stomach turned as I realized he must have known about this money the whole time, probably since mom died, and was just waiting for the right moment to grab it. 2 hours later, I called Aunt Linda, and she picked up on the first ring like she'd been waiting for my call. She immediately started crying and admitted that Dad had filed the paperwork 3 weeks ago and made her promise not to tell me because he was planning to surprise me with good news about paying for college. Through her sobs, she explained how he'd been borrowing money from her for months, $500 here, $1,000 there, always promising that this trust fund would pay everything back once he got access to it. That night, I couldn't sleep and just stared at the ceiling doing math in my head over and over. $80,000 already gone from the first account, now another $150,000 at risk, while I worked 2 jobs just to afford ramen and textbooks. Around 3 in the morning, Rachel found me surrounded by legal websites on my laptop trying to understand trust law, and she brought me chamomile tea without saying anything at first. She sat on my bed, and we both knew this was bigger than anything we could handle ourselves. The next morning, I skipped my chemistry lecture and walked straight to the campus financial aid office where Marcus Williams had helped me get emergency funding when I first found out about the stolen college fund. He listened as I explained about the second account, and when I finished, he leaned back in his chair and was quiet for a moment before telling me I needed a lawyer immediately. He wrote down the address of the university's legal aid clinic and said they dealt with custody and trust issues for students all the time. 3 days later, I found myself in the basement of the law school building under flickering fluorescent lights, filling out intake forms with shaking hands. I checked boxes about financial abuse and parental exploitation, while other students waited nearby with their own problems, and we all looked equally exhausted and scared. Grace Miller Martinez called my name and led me to a small office where she reviewed my documents with intense focus. She pointed to specific clauses in the trust paperwork and explained that my mother had been smart enough to include protective language requiring court approval for any early release. The trust specifically mentioned protection against financial exploitation, which meant we could file an immediate objection to freeze my dad's proceedings. That evening, my phone rang 15 times in a row with Dad's number, and I finally answered on the 16th call. His voice exploded through the speaker asking how dare I go to a lawyer when he was my father, and that money was for my education, which he was trying to provide. When I pointed out he'd already gambled away the first fund, he switched tactics and said Mom would be disgusted by how selfish I'd become. Later that night, I tried to focus on my economics homework in the campus library, but kept reading the same paragraph about supply and demand over and over. A text from Dad popped up on my phone showing a photo of him at Mom's grave with fresh flowers and a message saying he was visiting her since I wouldn't visit him. My hands shook with rage as I deleted it, but the image stayed burned in my mind. A week later, Grace and I went to the probate court to file our formal objection, and the clerk warned us that Dad's attorney had already submitted a 40-page brief, claiming I was being unduly influenced by radical anti-family elements at the university. Grace just shook her head and said Judge Hayes had seen these manipulation tactics 100 times before, but that didn't stop my dad from trying everything he could think of. Back at my dorm that night, I finally broke down and told my study group why I'd been missing so many sessions lately. They all sat there in stunned silence as I explained about the college fund and the legal battle and my dad showing up everywhere. Sarah, whose parents had gone through a really ugly divorce, pulled out her phone and started texting me her therapist's contact info, while Jake started passing around his baseball cap to collect money for my legal fees. There's something unsettling about how the dad knew about this second account all along, but never mentioned it while draining the first one. Makes me wonder what else he's been hiding from his own kid this whole time. Their kindness hit me harder than all of Dad's cruelty combined, and I started crying for the first time since this whole mess started. The next morning, my phone rang at 7, and it was Aunt Linda sounding breathless and excited. She'd gone to Dad's house while he was at the casino and found his gambling records in his home office desk drawer. She said he'd been tracking every single loss in a notebook with dates and amounts and which casino, and she could see he'd lost $30,000 just in the last month alone. She'd already made copies of everything and was driving straight to campus to bring them to me. I met her in the parking lot and grabbed the stack of papers with shaking hands. The next day, I brought everything to Grace's office and watched her eyes go wide as she flipped through page after page of Dad's own handwriting, documenting not just the $80,000 from my college fund, but another $120,000 in home equity loans and maxed out credit cards. Grace started taking photos of every single page while telling me this changed everything, because no judge would give him financial guardianship when he was this deep in debt and still gambling. After leaving her office, I sat in my car for 20 minutes, unable to make myself turn the key. A memory kept playing in my head of Mom teaching me to balance a checkbook when I was 10 years old, and telling me that money wasn't everything but security mattered, and I knew she would be absolutely horrified if she knew Dad had been gambling while she was dying in the hospital. The parking meter expired and someone honked at me, but I still couldn't move. 3 nights later, I was studying in my room when someone started pounding on my door so hard the whole frame shook. Dad was screaming that he knew I was in there and demanding I open up right now. Rachel grabbed her phone to call campus security while I pressed myself into the corner trying not to hyperventilate. Through the door, Dad kept switching between threats about withdrawing me from school and guilt trips about how my mother was crying in heaven, watching me betray my own father. Security showed up within 5 minutes and escorted him out, but not before half the girls on my floor had come out to see what was happening. 2 days later, I got called to the Dean of Students' office where she told me they'd issued an official no trespass order against my father and asked if I wanted additional security measures or counseling services. She kept saying they took parental harassment very seriously, but I couldn't shake the feeling that Dad was only getting worse. I finally took Sarah's advice and went to see the therapist she'd recommended. Dr. Morrison was this soft-spoken woman with kind eyes who let me talk for the entire hour without interrupting once. At the end, she said something about how grief was complicated when the person was still alive, but the relationship was dead, and those words hit me way harder than I expected. The next morning, Grace called with news that made my stomach drop. Dad had hired some big-shot attorney who usually handled million-dollar estates and was claiming I was mentally incompetent due to grief-induced paranoia about his gambling. The filing included sworn statements from 3 of his poker buddies saying they'd never seen him gamble in their lives. Grace and I spent the next 3 hours planning our response. She suggested getting character witnesses and documentation of my grades and attendance to prove I was the responsible one. Marcus from financial aid immediately agreed to testify about how well I'd handled all the emergency funding paperwork, and my professors sent letters about my perfect attendance and solid grades. We were building a case showing I was handling everything maturely, while Dad was the one spiraling out of control. A week later, I was at the grocery store near campus when I spotted Dad's car in the parking lot. My heart started racing, and I looked around but didn't see him anywhere. I left my cart right there and practically ran back to my own car, but not before noticing a parking ticket on his windshield dated 3 days earlier. He'd been watching me for days, and the realization made me so sick I had to pull over twice on the drive back to campus to throw up. Campus security took my report seriously when I showed them the parking ticket on his car. They pulled footage from the past 2 weeks and found his car in 6 different campus lots, always parked where he could watch my usual walking routes. The head of security assigned me an escort for my evening library shifts, which made me feel both safer and more scared at the same time. My boss at the library noticed something was wrong and suggested I take time off, but I needed every dollar from that job to pay for food and books. 3 weeks later, we finally had our first court hearing about the trust fund. Dad showed up in a suit I'd never seen him wear, sitting next to his lawyer who kept talking about how my dad was attending Gamblers Anonymous meetings and getting his life together. Then Grace pulled out a small notebook from her briefcase briefcase, one I recognized from our house. Dad's face went completely white when she started reading from it. The notebook had dates and amounts of every bet he'd made for the past 3 years, including an entry that said, "Lost Sarah's college fund. Will win. It back tomorrow." Written just 2 days after I'd confronted him. His lawyer tried to object, but the judge let Grace continue reading. Judge Hayes wasn't buying any of Dad's Reformed Gambler Act. She ordered a complete financial audit of all his accounts and said he had to get evaluated by a gambling addiction specialist before she'd even consider giving him access to Mom's trust. She also signed a restraining order right there in the courtroom, telling Dad he couldn't come within 500 feet of me or my campus. Dad stood up so fast his chair fell over and stormed out, his lawyer running after him. In the hallway, I heard him yell, "This isn't over," loud enough that the security guard stepped between us. That night, back in my dorm, Rachel made me soup, but I couldn't eat a single spoonful without feeling sick. My phone kept buzzing with texts from numbers I didn't recognize. All Dad's gambling buddies calling me ungrateful and selfish, saying I was spitting on my mother's memory by abandoning my father. I turned off my phone, but their words kept playing in my head. 3 days later, Aunt Linda showed up at my dorm with a tin of homemade cookies and a cardboard box I didn't recognize. She told me quietly that she'd gone to Dad's house when he was at the casino and rescued some of Mom's things he was planning to sell. Inside the box was Mom's wedding ring, her nursing pin from when she graduated, and photos from before she got sick, when her hair was still long and she could still pick me up. Linda held me while I cried harder than I had since the funeral. The next week, Grace called me to her downtown office with the financial audit results. Dad owed $340,000 to different creditors, with most of it being casino markers that were already in collections. His income from his warehouse job barely covered the minimum payments on his credit cards. Grace said no judge would give him access to the trust with that kind of debt, but warned me his lawyer would probably argue the trust should pay off his debts to stabilize the family unit, which made me want to throw up again. Things got worse when Dad didn't show up for his court-ordered psychological evaluation. His lawyer claimed he had a medical emergency, but Linda texted me a photo she'd taken of Dad's car in the casino parking lot that exact same afternoon. Grace immediately filed a motion about his non-compliance, and Judge Hayes scheduled an emergency hearing. 2 weeks after that disaster, I somehow managed to ace all my midterms and pulled a 3.8 GPA for the semester. Marcus from financial aid helped me apply for merit scholarships based on my grades, telling me I was thriving under pressure most students couldn't handle. It didn't feel like thriving though. It felt like barely keeping my head above water. Then Linda called with unexpected news. A security guard from the casino had reached out to her after hearing about our case from another employee. He'd been watching Dad lose money there for years and was willing to testify about the pattern. When I met him for coffee near campus, he told me something that broke my heart all over again. About 6 months before Mom died, when she was already so sick she could barely walk, she had come to the casino looking for Dad. The guard remembered because she was wearing a hospital bracelet and had to lean on the slot machines to stay standing, but she still dragged herself there to bring Dad home. That night, I had the worst dream about Mom. In it, she was healthy again, but looking at me with such disappointment, asking why I was being so cruel to Dad when he was all alone now. I woke up gasping and crying, with Rachel sitting on my bed holding my hand. She kept saying it was just my brain processing the stress, but the guilt felt so real I couldn't shake it for days. A month passed before the second hearing date finally came around. I walked into the courthouse early that morning and saw Dad already sitting at his table with a different lawyer. Grace had warned me his first attorney dropped him for not paying his bills. This new guy looked cheaper, wearing a wrinkled suit and shuffling through papers like he'd just gotten the case that morning. When the hearing started, he jumped up and started yelling about elder abuse and parental alienation. The judge banged her gavel hard and told him to sit down. He kept interrupting every witness, making wild claims about me manipulating the system. Judge Hayes had to bang her gavel again when he wouldn't stop talking over Grace. Dr. Novak took the stand next to talk about Dad's evaluation from the court-ordered sessions. Dad's keeping a notebook of his losses like it's some twisted diary. That's like a burglar writing down every house he robbed and then acting shocked when the police find it. He pulled out his notes and explained how Dad showed all the signs of severe gambling disorder. Dad's lawyer kept objecting, but the judge let Dr. Novak continue. He said Dad never showed real remorse during their sessions, just anger about getting caught. The worst part came when Dad's lawyer started asking me questions about Mom's death. He suggested I was taking out my grief on Dad unfairly. I had to tell everyone about finding betting slips in Mom's hospital bag while she was dying. My hands shook as I described how Dad missed her chemo appointments to play poker. Dad started shouting that I was making it all up. Judge Hayes called a 15-minute break and everyone filed out. I ran to the bathroom and splashed cold water on my face, trying to calm down. An older woman washing her hands next to me said she'd been through addiction hearings with her son. She squeezed my shoulder and told me I was doing the right thing before walking out. The next day, we were back in court for Grace to present our financial plan. She had folders full of budgets, scholarship applications, and my work history from both jobs. She showed the judge exactly how the trust money would cover my remaining 3 years of college. Judge Hayes asked lots of questions about each line item in the budget. Dad's lawyer tried to argue their plan was better, but couldn't provide any real documents. That evening after the hearing, I went to a support group meeting on campus that Marcus had told me about. 8 other students sat in the circle, all dealing with parents who'd stolen their college money. One girl's dad had taken out loans in her name without telling her. Another guy's mom had spent his entire inheritance on online shopping. We shared phone numbers and tips for dealing with the legal system. 3 days later, Grace called me with shocking news. She'd been reviewing bank documents and found a loan application with my signature on it. The problem was, I'd never signed anything like that. Dad had forged my name trying to use the trust as collateral for a $50,000 loan. Grace immediately called the prosecutor's office to report the fraud. They assigned Detective Murray to investigate the forgery. He came to campus to get samples of my real signature and asked me detailed questions about my banking history. 2 days later, he called to say they had security footage of Dad at the bank submitting the fake application. He said Dad wasn't as smart as he thought, and they had everything they needed. I was driving back from my evening shift at the restaurant when I stopped for gas near campus. My stomach dropped when I saw Dad's car at the next pump. He stood there holding the gas nozzle, just staring staring at me with empty eyes. For a second, I remembered him teaching me to ride my bike in our driveway. Then he mouthed the word traitor, and the moment broke. I got back in my car with shaking hands and drove away fast. 3 days later on Sunday afternoon, Aunt Linda called me crying so hard I could barely understand her. The police had shown up during their family dinner to arrest Dad for fraud. She said they put handcuffs on him right there in front of all the neighbors who were outside. Dad kept screaming my name over and over, saying I'd done this to him on purpose. Part of me felt bad hearing her cry about it. Grace called me an hour later after hearing about the arrest and reminded me that Dad had done this to himself. A week later, I sat in the back row of the courtroom watching Dad get arraigned for fraud. The public defender they assigned him looked like he hadn't slept in days and kept shuffling through papers while the judge read the charges. Dad stood there in an orange jumpsuit with his hands cuffed in front of him, and when he turned to scan the courtroom, his eyes locked on mine. He mouthed something I couldn't make out, but his face was twisted with anger. The judge set bail at $50,000 with conditions that made my lawyer Grace squeeze my hand under the table. No contact with me, no gambling of any kind, and no attempts to access the trust fund while the case was pending. His lawyer argued for lower bail, but the prosecutor brought up his gambling history, and the judge shut it down fast. They processed him out that afternoon, and Linda texted me that he was staying at her house. Back at school the next day, I tried to focus on my economics homework, but my professor pulled me aside after class. She put her hand on my shoulder and asked if I was doing okay since she'd heard about my family situation. The whole campus probably knew by now since one of my classmates had seen the news article about Dad's arrest online. She offered to give me an extension on my paper, but I told her I needed to keep my normal schedule, or I'd go crazy thinking about everything. 2 days later, Grace called me during lunch to tell me the casino security guard was giving his deposition. I met her at the law office downtown, where we watched through video link as this guy in a cheap suit laid out Dad's gambling history with receipts and security footage timestamps. The numbers made my stomach drop. $450,000 over 5 years at just the casinos this guard worked at. He pulled up records showing Dad had been banned from 2 different casinos for getting aggressive with dealers when he was losing. The worst part was when he showed the dates and proved the pattern started before Mom died, back when she first got diagnosed with cancer. Grace had to grab tissues from her desk when I started crying. That weekend, Linda asked me to come to her house and I almost said no, but she sounded so sad on the phone. She had photo albums spread across her kitchen table when I got there, all pictures from when Dad was younger. There was one of him and Mom on their wedding day, and he looked so different, actually happy instead of desperate. Linda picked up another photo of Dad holding me as a baby, and her voice cracked when she said he was different back then. She kept saying Mom brought out the best in him, and when she got sick, something inside him just broke. I wanted to feel bad for him, but all I felt was anger that he chose poker chips over dealing with his grief like a normal person. 3 weeks passed before everything went to hell again. Grace called me at 2 in the morning, and I knew something was wrong before she even spoke. Dad had been caught at a casino across the state line in Indiana, sitting at a blackjack table with $1,000 in chips. The prosecutor filed to revoke his bail immediately. At the hearing the next morning, Dad's lawyer tried to argue he was just having dinner at the casino restaurant, but the prosecutor had security footage showing him at the table for 3 hours straight. The judge looked disgusted as she watched the footage on her laptop. She revoked his bail on the spot, and the bailiffs cuffed him right there in the courtroom. He started yelling that this was entrapment and I was destroying his life, but they dragged him out before he could finish. With Dad locked up, the trust proceedings suddenly moved way faster. 2 weeks later, we were back in probate court, and Judge Hayes actually seemed relieved not to have Dad interrupting every 5 minutes. Grace presented our case perfectly, showing my grades, my financial aid applications, and my clear plan for using the trust money for education. Dad's lawyer tried to argue that we were kicking a man while he was down, but even he didn't sound convinced. The judge took less than an hour to make her decision. That afternoon, I went to the cemetery alone for the first time since all this started. I sat next to Mom's headstone and told her everything about the hidden trust and Dad's addiction, and how scared and angry I felt all the time now. The cemetery was empty except for some maintenance workers in the distance and wind moving through the oak trees. I brought yellow roses because those were her favorite, and arranged them in the little vase attached to her stone. For the first time in months, I felt something close to peace, even though tears were running down my face. Rachel came with me the next day to look at apartments for next year since I couldn't stay in the dorms forever. We found a small place about 10 minutes from campus with good locks and a doorman who actually paid attention to who came in and out. The landlord was this older woman who asked why 2 college kids needed such a secure building, and when I gave her the short version of my dad's situation, she immediately offered to put the lease only in Rachel's name. She said she'd been through something similar with an ex-husband and understood the need for protection. These little kindnesses from strangers kept catching me off guard. 3 days later, we were back in court for the final ruling on the trust. Judge Hayes didn't waste any time and granted me full access to the $150,000, with Grace acting as financial advisor until I turned 21. She denied Dad's request completely and spent 10 minutes explaining her reasoning while looking directly at his empty chair. She cited his gambling addiction and criminal charges and what she called his complete failure to act in his daughter's best interests. She even ordered him to pay my legal fees, though Grace whispered that we'd never see a penny of that money. That night, I sat in my dorm room with the trust documents spread across my desk and couldn't bring myself to celebrate. Rachel brought Chinese food and tried to get me excited about having money for school, but all I could think about was Mom working double shifts at the hospital and the factory. She skipped meals to save money and wore the same 3 outfits for years and never bought anything for herself. This money felt wrong somehow, like it was covered in everything that had happened. Rachel sat next to me on my bed and reminded me that Mom wanted me to have a future, and I should let her give me that even if she wasn't here to see it. Dad forged my signature on a loan application. That's where he crossed from just being a mess to actually becoming a criminal who'd steal from his own kid to feed his habit. A month passed, and I threw myself into classes while waiting for the legal stuff to move forward. Dad's public defender called me one afternoon between my chemistry and English classes. He explained they were offering Dad a plea deal for probation and mandated treatment if he'd plead guilty to the fraud charges. The prosecutor wanted my input before moving forward. I told them I'd support it only only if it included a permanent restraining order and full restitution for that forged loan. I didn't want him in prison, but I needed him to stop. The next week, I met with Marcus at the financial aid office to restructure everything now that I had access to Mom's trust. We sat at his desk going through spreadsheets and budget plans that would get me through graduation without any more loans. He mentioned his own dad had addiction issues and how setting boundaries saved his sanity. Every Wednesday, I started meeting Aunt Linda for coffee at the campus Starbucks. She kept apologizing and crying about how she'd enabled Dad for years by giving him money and believing his lies. We talked about how his gambling had poisoned our whole family and how we both needed to heal from it. Then Grace called with something that changed everything. She'd been digging through Mom's medical records for the trust paperwork and found something nobody expected. Mom had opened that second trust just 2 weeks after getting her terminal diagnosis. The banknotes Grace found were clear about Mom's intentions. The banker had written that the client was concerned about her husband's gambling problem and wanted ironclad protection for her daughter's future. Mom knew about Dad's problem the whole time. That revelation sent me back to the boxes of Mom's things Aunt Linda had saved. I found Mom's journal from her last months buried under old photo albums. Her handwriting was shaky from the chemo, but the words were clear. She wrote about finding lottery tickets in Dad's coat pockets after he promised to stop. She wrote about her fear of leaving me with nothing. She wrote about setting up the trust without telling him because she couldn't trust him anymore. 2 weeks later, Dad accepted the plea deal at a hearing I had to attend. His voice was flat and emotionless as he admitted to forging my signature and attempting to access the trust through fraud. The judge asked if he understood the harm he'd caused. Dad said yes, but his eyes told a different story, like he still thought he was the real victim here. Spring break came, and instead of going somewhere fun like my classmates, I stayed on campus to work extra shifts at both my jobs. The empty dorms felt peaceful, and I used the quiet time to catch up on coursework. I also started seeing the campus therapist, Dr. Morrison, regularly to process everything. She helped me understand I was grieving 2 losses, losing my father to addiction, and then losing him again to betrayal. The restitution hearing happened 3 weeks later at the courthouse downtown. The judge determined Dad owed me $18,000 for the fraudulent loan he'd taken out in my name. Dad's attorney argued that garnishing his wages would hurt his recovery, but the judge said consequences were part of accountability. Dad muttered something about ungrateful children loud enough for everyone in the courtroom to hear. Back in my dorm, I was going through more of Mom's things when I found a photo from my 10th birthday. Dad had me on his shoulders and we were both laughing while Mom took the picture. On the back, she'd written in her neat handwriting, "Before the sickness, both kinds." I realized she meant Dad's gambling was already destroying things even in what I thought were our happiest moments. The next week, I had my worst panic attack yet during statistics class. The professor was explaining probability and gambling odds and how the house always wins. The room started spinning and I couldn't breathe. Rachel found me hyperventilating in the bathroom and skipped the rest of class to walk me to the counseling center. Dr. Morrison fit me in immediately, and we spent an hour working through breathing exercises. The counseling sessions became my weekly lifeline while the legal stuff dragged on for weeks. A month later, Dad finally started his court-ordered treatment program at a place called Serenity Springs just outside Columbus. The facility had to send progress reports to the court every 2 weeks about how he was doing. The first report came to Grace's office, and she shared it with me during our meeting. Dad was showing up to all the required sessions, but the counselor wrote that he showed minimal engagement and kept deflecting responsibility for his actions. According to the notes, he spent most of group therapy time telling everyone how his daughter betrayed him and stole his money. Around the same time, I found an online support group for kids of gambling addicts through a link Dr. Morrison gave me. Late at night in my dorm, I'd scroll through hundreds of stories that sounded just like mine. One woman posted about her mom gambling away her entire wedding fund the week before the ceremony. Another guy shared how his father lost their family home betting on football games. We all traded coping strategies and the kind of dark jokes that only people who've been through this stuff would understand. 3 weeks into Dad's treatment, Aunt Linda called me crying and shaking with anger. She'd been getting calls from cousins and relatives I hadn't talked to in years, all asking what was going on. Dad had somehow been calling them from the treatment facility, spinning this whole story about how I'd stolen my inheritance and abandoned him when he needed me most. Before Linda could set everyone straight, my phone started blowing up with angry messages from family members I barely knew. Cousin Marie texted that I was a selfish brat who didn't deserve my mother's memory. Uncle Tom's wife sent a long Facebook message about respecting your elders and how disappointed my mom would be. The family basically split into 2 camps, those who knew about Dad's gambling history and those who believed his victim story. The worst part came on a Thursday afternoon when I was heading back to my dorm after chemistry lab. This cousin I'd met maybe twice in my life, Jessica from Dad's side, was standing outside my building arguing with a desk attendant. The second she saw me, she started screaming about elder abuse and how I was a gold digger waiting for my mom's money. Rachel heard the yelling from our room and came running down while I tried to explain the real situation to Jessica. She wouldn't listen and kept getting louder, calling me heartless and saying I was dead to the family. Campus security showed up and made her leave, but I stood there shaking for 20 minutes afterward. Dr. Morrison helped me process it during our next session and suggested we write a letter to the family members who seemed genuinely confused rather than hostile. We spent the whole hour drafting this factual explanation without any emotional language, just the timeline of events and copies of the court documents including the restraining order. She kept reminding me that I couldn't control how people responded, only my own truth. I sent the letter to about 15 relatives who had reached out with questions rather than accusations. Over the next 3 weeks, some of them responded with apologies and messages of support. Aunt Linda's sister wrote that she'd always suspected something was wrong, but didn't want to cause drama. Uncle Pete, Dad's own brother, called me one evening and his voice was heavy with guilt. He said he'd suspected the gambling for years but didn't want to interfere in our family business. He told me my mom had asked him to watch out for me before she died, and he felt like he'd failed both of us. Others stayed loyal to Dad no matter what evidence I showed them. Finals week approached, and I threw myself into studying harder than ever before. The library became my safe space where Dad's chaos couldn't reach me, and I could focus on something I could actually control. Despite everything going on, I was holding on to my 3.8 great GPA, and my economics professor pulled me aside after class. She offered me a paid research assistant position for the summer with flexible hours that would work around any court dates. It was the first genuinely good news I'd gotten in months. Then Grace called with an update that made my stomach drop. Dad had completed his 90-day treatment program, but got caught the very next day using someone else's ID at a casino 40 miles away. This violated his probation terms, and Judge Hayes ordered him back to treatment, but this time to a residential facility where he'd have to stay for at least 6 months. Before he had to report to the new facility, his lawyer delivered a letter to Grace's office that was meant for me. It was 10 pages of pure manipulation and blame, with Dad writing about how Mom would be ashamed of what I'd become. He called me cold and controlling just like her, which hurt even though I knew it was just his addiction talking. The worst part was the last paragraph where he admitted he'd known about the second trust fund all along. He'd been planning to access it once I turned 21, and he could convince me to make him a beneficiary. That night, Rachel and I took the letter out behind our dorm building with a metal trash can she'd borrowed from the janitor's closet. I lit each page on fire and watched them curl up and turn black while other students walked by, probably thinking we were crazy. Rachel stood guard and made sure no one called campus security while I performed my little ritual of letting go. Each burning page felt like I was choosing my own peace over his chaos and deciding that his poison couldn't touch me anymore. Summer came faster than I expected, and with Dad locked up in residential treatment for the next 6 months, I finally felt safe enough to look for an apartment off campus. Mom had this all figured out before she left, setting up that trust like she was playing chess while Dad was stuck on checkers. That's some serious planning from beyond the grave right there. Grace helped me set up automatic transfers from the trust for rent and bills, so I wouldn't have to worry about money for the first time since Mom died. The place I found was small, just a 1-bedroom near High Street, but it had good locks and a security system that made me feel protected. Moving day arrived in early June, and Rachel showed up with boxes and packing tape while Aunt Linda brought her SUV to help haul everything. We loaded up my stuff from the dorm in 2 trips and spent the afternoon setting up my new space. Rachel helped me hang photos on the walls, all pictures of Mom from before she got sick, none with Dad in them. Aunt Linda pulled out a wooden recipe box from her bag and pressed it into my hands. She told me Mom would want me to have it, and inside I found all her handwritten recipe cards, including the one for her famous lasagna. We cooked it together that night, and the smell filled my apartment with memories of Saturday dinners when Mom was alive. The next Monday, I started my summer research position in the economics department, analyzing financial impacts of addiction on families. My professor didn't know about my personal connection to the topic, but the work felt important, like I was turning my mess into something useful. I spent my days buried in data and statistics, finding patterns in how gambling addiction destroys family wealth across generations. 3 weeks into the job, I came home from the library to find a man in a cheap suit standing outside my apartment door. He introduced himself as a private investigator and said my dad had hired him to check on my welfare. When I asked what he really wanted, he admitted Dad wanted to know if I was wasting the trust money on parties and drugs. I slammed the door in his face and immediately called Grace, who contacted the prosecutor about this probation violation. The emergency hearing happened 2 days later, and Judge Hayes looked ready to explode when she heard about the PI. She extended Dad's treatment by 3 months and modified the restraining order to include no third-party contact attempts. She stared right at Dad's lawyer and said his obsession with my finances over my well-being was exactly why he had access to neither. Walking out of court that day, I realized I'd had my first good day in months. I'd aced a presentation that morning, had lunch with friends who didn't know about any of this drama, and hadn't thought about Dad until bedtime. Dr. Morrison had told me progress wouldn't be linear, but this felt like real growth, like I was finally building something separate from his chaos. A few weeks later in mid-July, my uncle drove up from Cincinnati with a box of old photos. He spread them out on my coffee table and told me stories about Mom from before she met Dad. He said she worked 3 jobs to put herself through nursing school and never complained once. When she met Dad, she thought she could save him the same way she saved patients. We talked for hours about patterns and cycles and how love can't cure addiction no matter how much you want it to. The research project started getting attention, and my professor asked if I wanted to co-author a paper on intergenerational financial trauma. I spent days thinking about whether to include my own story anonymously in the data. Finally, I decided to write it, not for Dad or the family drama, but for other students going through the same nightmare alone. In early August, Dad's treatment facility called to report he'd been caught gambling with other residents using commissary items as chips. They were considering discharging him for non-compliance, and his counselor suggested family therapy might help his recovery. I told her firmly that his recovery couldn't depend on my participation, repeating exactly what Dr. Morrison had taught me about boundaries. On what would have been Mom's 50th birthday, I drove to the cemetery with yellow roses and sat by her headstone. I told her about the trust and school, and how I was protecting myself from Dad's addiction. A butterfly landed on the flowers while I was talking, and even though it was probably just coincidence, it felt like she was telling me I was doing the right thing. 2 weeks later, I got the call from Aunt while I was packing for junior year. Dad had checked himself out of the treatment center against medical advice after only 3 days. The counselor told her he'd been impossible during group sessions, and kept insisting he didn't have a problem. Within hours of leaving, security cameras caught him at the Rivers Casino downtown, trying to use a fake ID since he was on the exclusion list. The security guard recognized him from the photo they'd circulated and called the police immediately. They arrested him right there at the blackjack table with chips in his hand. The prosecutor called me the next morning and said Dad was looking at 6 to 12 months in county jail for violating his probation. I hung up and went back to sorting my textbooks. Over the next few weeks, I threw myself into preparing for school. My grades from sophomore year had gotten me into the honors program, and I'd applied for dozens of internships. The one at Morrison Financial Planning called me back first. During the interview, the manager kept looking at my resume and asking how someone my age knew so much about trust protection and financial abuse. I just told her I'd done a lot of research. She offered me the position on the spot. The sentencing hearing was set for the last week of August. I drove down with Aunt and sat in the back row of the courtroom. Dad stood up when it was his turn to speak and started rambling about being persecuted by his ungrateful daughter, who'd turned everyone against him. Judge Hayes cut him off mid-sentence. She looked right at him and said he'd been given multiple chances at treatment and had chosen gambling over freedom, over his daughter, over everything. She sentenced him to 8 months in county jail. As the bailiff put the cuffs on, Dad turned and looked at me one last time. For just a second, I saw real fear in his eyes. Then it turned back to anger. He mouthed the words, "This is your fault," as they led him toward the door. Aunt grabbed my hand and squeezed it hard. She whispered that it wasn't my fault, and we both knew she was right. That night, back in my apartment, I felt something change inside me. Not forgiveness, definitely not that, but some kind of weight lifting off my chest. Dad was in jail, the trust was safe, and I had my whole life ahead of me. I slept 8 hours straight for the first time since this whole mess started. Junior year began with me moving the rest of my stuff into the apartment and setting up a real study space. I made friends in my honors seminars who didn't know anything about my family drama. At the internship, I started specializing in cases involving gambling addiction and financial abuse. My supervisor kept commenting on how I seemed to understand these situations better than interns twice my age. In October, I met with Grace at her office to set up a long-term financial plan. She showed me spreadsheets proving the trust would cover my undergraduate degree, graduate school if I wanted, and still have money left over. We also set aside $10,000 in an emergency fund for Aunt, who'd spent so much of her savings helping me through everything. Grace looked at me across her desk and said my mom would be proud of how I was handling everything. For once, I actually believed her. 3 weeks later, I was in the library when my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. The nurse on the other end said Dad had suffered a mild heart attack and was in the jail's medical ward. He was stable but scared and kept asking for me. I told her I wasn't coming and hung up. Later, I called Dr. Morrison, who reminded me I wasn't responsible for Dad's health or his choices. I did send a get well card through Aunt that just said get well and nothing else. The research paper I'd been working on with my economics professor got accepted to the Journal of Financial Abuse Studies in December. We'd included an anonymous case study about parental gambling addiction and trust fund theft. My professor said it could help change how universities identify and support students dealing with financial abuse. Dad got transferred back to regular jail after 2 weeks in the medical ward. His lawyer filed a motion for early release citing his health problems. The judge denied it but agreed to let him serve the last 2 months on house arrest with an ankle monitor. The conditions were strict with no gambling, no contact with me, and daily check-ins with his probation officer. I spent the next few weeks getting ready for his release by changing everything. Got a new phone number through the campus tech center and only gave it to people I trusted. Campus security added my name to their watch list after Marcus pulled some strings. My apartment building installed a new keypad lock, and I made sure the landlord knew not to let anyone claiming to be family inside. The HR person at my part-time job at the bookstore put a note in my file about not giving out my schedule. These changes felt like building a wall around my new life. 2 months later, Aunt Linda called to tell me Dad was out and staying at her place for house arrest. She said he looked older and moved slower, like something inside him had broken. The ankle monitor beeped if he went past the mailbox, and he spent most days watching game shows. She told me he asked about me once, but she just said I was doing fine and changed the subject. I kept going to class and working my internship at the financial planning office downtown. My grades stayed high, and I made actual friends who didn't know about Dad unless I wanted to tell them. Some days I went from morning until bedtime without thinking about him at all. My therapist, Dr. Morrison, said this was normal and healthy. She called it integration, where the bad stuff becomes part of your story, but not the main part. So the private investigator Dad hired was supposedly checking on her welfare, but really wanted to know if she was partying with the trust money. That feels like such a weird priority for someone who should be focusing on recovery instead of trying to control money he already lost. After another month, Aunt Linda told me Dad finished house arrest without any problems. The court made him keep going to outpatient treatment 3 times a week and get a job. He found work at a warehouse loading trucks on the night shift. She said he seemed tired all the time, but followed all the rules. The restraining order stayed permanent, which meant he couldn't contact me ever. One afternoon, I was studying at the campus coffee shop when someone said my name. It was the security guard from the casino who had testified at the trial. He was visiting his granddaughter who went to my school. We sat down and he bought me a latte. He mentioned that Dad still showed up outside the casino sometimes, just standing on the sidewalk since his probation banned him from going inside. He said it looked sad watching him stand there staring at the doors. I didn't feel happy or sad about it. I just felt nothing like hearing about a stranger. Senior year started and everything was falling into place. I got accepted to a summer program for financial counseling that the trust would pay for completely. Started applying to graduate schools to become a financial advisor who helps families dealing with addiction problems. Mom's money wasn't just paying for school anymore. It was giving me a purpose and a career path. Aunt Linda called one evening to tell me Dad found out about my Dean's List achievement through some cousin who saw it on the university website. He wrote me a letter that she grabbed from the mailbox before he could send it. She didn't read it, but said she could tell from watching him write it that he still wasn't taking responsibility for anything. She burned it in her backyard fire pit while I was on the phone with her. We were protecting each other now instead of protecting him. When the anniversary of Mom's death came around, I went to the financial aid office with an idea. Using some investment returns from the trust, I set up a small scholarship for students whose families lost their college money to addiction. Marcus helped with the paperwork, and the first recipient was a freshman whose mom gambled away her savings on online poker. We met for coffee and I told her things would get better, even though it didn't feel like it now. She cried and hugged me and said nobody else understood what it was like. Spring semester flew by with job interviews and graduate school applications. I got magna cum laude honors and accepted a position at a financial planning firm that specialized in trust management. Also got into graduate school with a teaching assistantship. Everything Mom saved for was happening even better than she probably imagined. The girl who found that bank letter 3 years ago felt like someone I used to know. Graduation day arrived sunny and perfect. I put on my cap and gown in my apartment bathroom mirror and thought about Mom working those double shifts at the hospital and the grocery store. Walking across that stage when they called my name felt like floating. In the crowd, I saw Aunt Linda crying and Uncle Bill recording everything on his phone. Rachel was cheering so loud people turned to look at her. Marcus stood with the faculty clapping and giving me a thumbs up. Dad wasn't there because of the restraining order and because we weren't family anymore. anymore. Mom wasn't there either, but her sacrifice was everywhere. I was graduating debt-free with a job and a future, and the knowledge of how to help other people going through what I survived. The diploma had my name on it, but it belonged to Mom, really. Standing there in my cap and gown, I smiled, thinking about her sitting at our kitchen table after her shifts, counting out money for my college fund, and imagining this exact moment. She saved me with that money, but she also saved me by showing me how to work hard and plan ahead and never give up on your dreams, even when life gets impossible. She saved me completely. Time really does fly when you're rebuilding an empire from the ashes while your dad's stuck staring at casino doors like a kid banned from the candy. Like the video, it helps more than you think.